for joining today's webinar, and at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Bill.
All right, thanks a lot, Michelle. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning, and welcome to the monthly HBK Risk Advisory webinar series. We're going to discuss what's a very underutilized tool is the risk assessment. So again, we'll just dive in and get going. All right, so here's our agenda for what we're going to cover this morning. I'm not going to reread everything, but I will go through a few housekeeping issues right now. So we've muted all the incoming lines on today's webinar, but if you experience any issues, we are going to be monitoring the message control center, so you can communicate with us through that mechanism. And then we are going to, the goal is to leave 5-ish so minutes at the end of the presentation for questions. So if you do have questions, you can tee them up as we go, putting them into the Q&A box. We'll get them there, or you can just wait until we're done with the presentation of the slides, and then we'll do the Q&A at the end. There is a PDF copy of today's webinar slides that you can download from the message center. And we are recording today's webinar, so you can we'll send out a link probably by the end of this week that has a URL in it that you can replay the webinar if you want to pass it on to any colleagues or anything like that. As well as we are doing CPE today, so today's webinar will qualify for 1 hour of continuing education credit. So in order to get that credit, you just have to stay online for the entirety of this morning's presentation and answer 4 content-sensitive questions, of which the 4th one is a real difficult one. That's, do you want CPE for today's webinar, yes or no? If you want CPE, just answer yes to that, and we'll get you a certificate within a few days after the conclusion of today's webinar. So this, moving on, these are the learning objectives for today's webinar. Now this is a more recent addition to our webinars. It's really the takeaways of what benefits you'll gain from attending today's webinar. And it's something that we're required to put it in now because we changed continuing education firms. So this is one of their requirements. So we put it in, but it is some value, and it kind of lets the participant know what to expect about the webinar that they're attending. Here's my bio. I've been at HBK for almost 5 years now. I do have a dual role, so I work primarily in the IT department, doing our IT security for the firm and HBKS, and also do some project work for clients on an external basis. So like I said, a dual role here at HBK. So without further ado, let's dive into the main parts of our topic today, the risk assessments. So first I'm going to discuss the background and of what a risk assessment is and why you need to do it. And I'll start out with some terminology. So here are what I feel are the main terms that everybody should be familiar with prior to undertaking the task of executing on your own risk assessment. So I won't read them all here, but I'll go through them one by one on the upcoming slides. So first off, risk. The combination of a probability of an event and its consequence. Now, everybody typically just jumps to the one side of the equation and says, all right, risk is bad, but that's not necessarily the case. You could have a positive risk outcome or a negative risk outcome, but by definition, you can get either one of those. So just keep that in mind. Next, moving on to an asset. So this is what we're going to try to protect. This is one of the main reasons why we do a risk assessment, so that we can control or try to predict a better outcome or get a better outcome, but in the end game, you're basically going to try to protect your assets. So you don't want people getting, taking advantage of you, stealing your assets, whether that be tangible or intangible. An intangible asset could be something. A good example might be your business's reputation. So if you're a victim of a cyber breach, all of a sudden it's probably going to be, especially if maybe you're a bank and you were just attacked, maybe you're going to have a difficult time getting new customers because nobody wants to put their money with an institution that they don't feel it's safe. So reputation could be a good example of an intangible asset, or it could actually be money. They're trying to get into your bank accounts and actually do a funds withdrawal. Okay, and like I said, we're doing CPE for today's event. So here is your first question that for those of you that want CPE can answer. So I'll just stop yakking for a minute or so here so that people can answer the question. Michelle, let me know when it looks like, I think you can see how many responses we're getting to the question. So when it starts to get close, you can just give me a sign or something that says that we're getting close. We've had enough people respond, so we can move on. We'll just give a few more seconds here. All right, thanks, Michelle. So then moving on to our next key term would be a threat. So that's basically anything that can act against an asset that could do it harm. And like I described previously before the question, you could have somebody trying to steal money out of a bank account, trying to just basically maybe launch a ransomware attack on your system and create where you can't do business. And so that's basically two bad outcomes that are basically come through a threat. And then moving on, vulnerability. So this is a weakness in the design or implementation. It's not necessarily, by default, it's a good thing because it's, you're putting in something like a computer system or a new network or a new Wi-Fi system, but you have to make sure that those systems are properly patched or up to snuff so that they're going to perform as intended. So, and if you're not doing that, then that's where the vulnerability portion of it comes into play. And a couple of examples of vulnerabilities, like I just said, maybe you're not patching your software, your hardware, or the developer of that equipment or software is going to monitor those products for a while, and they're going to quote unquote patch them to bring them up to speed to eliminate vulnerabilities or weaknesses. So you have to take advantage of that. Another vulnerability could be, an example is like security awareness training, which, if you attended my webinars in the past, I talk about it quite frequently. But so one of the weakest links in any business is their employees, unfortunately, because employees by nature want to help people and do good. So any of these phishing emails that come across with, trying to entice somebody to help them, that's the first instinct. So employees often click on the link and then malware is introduced to the system, ransomware, whatever it may be. So that could be considered a vulnerability that you need to properly train your staff on security awareness. And if you're not doing that, then that would be where the vulnerability would come into play. Then a couple terms here wrapping up, and then we'll move on to the next agenda item. But residual risk, this is like what the risk that's left over. So I always tell people that it's unrealistic to expect to have a zero risk environment. That basically never occurs, probably statistically can occur. because you're always going to have some risk. Again, it could be positive, it could be negative, but you're always going to have risk, and residual is what's left over even after you've mitigated the situation to try to reduce the risk as much as possible. And then inherent risk, our last term, this is the risk that you just get because of a situation, and it's taken into usually measured before you even do any type of mitigation. But it's tough to have a zero risk environment. So let's move on to our new next topic. I guess it is a new topic, or the next topic. But let's talk about some reasons why you should conduct a risk assessment. So here's just four reasons that I've got up here on the screen. Could be that you're mandated to do a risk assessment. So if your business is in healthcare, there might be some reason why you absolutely positively on a regular basis have to do a risk assessment. Another reason could be to reduce your operational risk. Closely tied to that would be to improve your probability of achieving your organizational objectives. So those are very closely related. But you most likely every year you do business planning, and you set targets on how much growth you're going to have, or how many new customers you're going to gain, or what your sales dollars are going to be. And then a risk assessment is you look at it from a different perspective to see what types of risks you're possibly that could be coming at you. And if you can reduce those risks, then you're going to increase your probability of meeting your goals and your targets for the year. And a last reason of why to do a risk assessment just could be to improve safety. Maybe you're a manufacturer, you've got the shop floor with a lot of equipment used in your manufacturing process, and maybe if you're not doing proper maintenance on those machines, they may malfunction and somebody could get hurt. So that's another reason to do a risk assessment. So it doesn't have to specifically be in the area of IT. It could just be just an operational type risk assessment as well. And that takes us to our next checkpoint question for CPE. So I'll be quiet here and let you read the question and answer for those who want CPE to answer the question. Michelle, when it looks like people are done, go ahead and let me know. Okay, thanks, Michelle. All right, so let's move on and talk to our next agenda item and go over the risk assessment steps if you decide to perform a risk assessment. All right, so at a high level, I was looking at the ISO standard 27001, and this is just the high level steps of performing a risk assessment. The first one, establishing a framework. Then you have to identify your risks, analyze your risks, evaluate those risks, and then decide what you're going to do about those risks. And we'll talk about that in more detail as far as the apply risk management options towards the end of the presentation. So here's our first step, is to establish a risk assessment framework. So you could do that. There's a number of different organizations out there that will give you information on conducting a risk assessment. Could be NIST, which is part of the US government. ISACA, which is a Security and Controls Organization, ISO, which I referenced before with the 27001, or I'm sure there's many other frameworks that you could find out there. But what do you want to use the framework for? And it's just basically on this slide that you want your framework is basically telling you your rules for performing a risk assessment. And so you want to basically do this on regular intervals. Now, a lot of requirements, if you're mandated to do it, is going to say an annual risk assessment. You want to make sure that your process is consistent so that you can repeat it. It's kind of like a recipe or a cookbook from that perspective. It'll tell you what documentation you should retain. It'll help you to establish your baselines, and then it'll determine your approach. So there's two basic approaches that you can utilize when doing a risk assessment. First being asset-based, and the second one scenario-based. I personally think that an asset-based risk assessment makes more logical sense. It's easier for me to get my head around, and it just makes more sense. So that's what we're going to discuss here when I'll go through kind of like a little case study on doing a risk assessment. But you could have a scenario-based risk assessment as well. So keep that in mind. So here's the first part of our case study. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on this example as being an asset-based risk register risk assessment. So I'm going to build out, and I'll go through a series of like 3 or 4 slides here that I'll just keep adding to this register and putting more parts in it that'll help it make more sense. But I'm starting out that basically building out an inventory. So if you think about it, it's when we talked before about we're protecting assets. So we're really just compiling our asset inventory, so to speak. Now, again, you could have things on this like employees could be assets. You could list them as an inventory line item if you choose to. Your reputation, could be tangible or intangible. But again, I'm just going with strictly tangible assets here because it's easier to get our heads around and understand and explain. So I've got the list here of basically some desktops, laptops, printers, phones, iPads, routers, software, et cetera, et cetera. And I have an asset owner and I have a risk owner. So really you want to make sure that somebody is responsible for the asset. And these all being IT related assets, it's going to be your IT manager, your IT director, or CIO, just depending on how your management structured. So it could be, but then you're going to have the asset owner and then a risk owner. So for example, maybe our CIO is the asset owner, but our COO or chief operating officer is the actual risk owner. So what you're going to typically see is that you move up higher in the organization to assign ownership. Whether you call it a CIO versus COO or IT manager versus operations manager, it's really just just the naming things. It's not one's better or worse, but you just have to follow into how your organization is structured and what titles you decide to give out. So the second step after you have your inventory is you want to be able to identify where your risks are. So again, you're going to want to, these were 2 of the key terms that we defined. You're going to want to figure out what your threats are and then what vulnerabilities you have. So it's a very straightforward step, but again, it's probably a time-consuming step. And so what I've done is, you'll see I build out my risk register a little bit further by putting in the threat and the vulnerability. So if we just look at a couple examples from the list, is So maybe I've got an iPhone 10, like kind of in the middle of the list there. And my threat is, that somebody's going to steal it or my employee's going to lose it. And what the vulnerability would be is that I have an unprotected device out there that could get network access. So the way I'm going to the end game, what we're going to do is we're going to try to look at all these threats and figure out how to mitigate our risks. So maybe we're going to buy some software that we can wipe the iPhone if it, all of a sudden if it's unaccounted for. So that's where this is, ultimately going, but we're building it out in steps. And as you can see, we took our asset register and just expanded it out by adding the threat and the vulnerability. So then I'll just keep walking through the risk assessment example here for you, and then we'll analyze the risks. So when you do that, everybody's risk tolerance is going to be different, and I've called it here risk appetite. And then you have to have some type of scale and a way to calculate it so that you've got that repeatable process that I referenced earlier. So again, my calculation that I'm going to use is a pretty standard one, and it's just the impact and the likelihood, meaning that I could have a risk, but if that risk occurs, the impact, will be very bad but the likelihood is, not that high of a probability. So you want to measure all that. And, just a regular scenario is that, I have that a tornado would come through and impact my business. So obviously if my building took a direct hit from a tornado, that would be a huge impact, but the likelihood, my business has been here for X number of years and we've never had a tornado. So maybe the likelihood is very remote. So you can, on your risk assessment, you can have the, business impacted by a tornado, and the impact might be a 3 on a scale of 1 to 3, but the likelihood is a 1, so that you just work things through that type of function. And then we're going to move on to our third CPE question. So I'll stop yakking here a little bit so people can read that and answer those questions. Okay, and Michelle, when people start to, where you see that we've got the consistent number of people answering the CPE, just let me know and go ahead and forward the slide for me so I know to keep talking. All right, so everybody, we got a number of people filling out our CPE questions. So again, I talked about the scoring the risk. So again, I gave you the example of the tornado with the impact and the likeliness, and then you do the math and come up with your risk. So again, if you just look at some of these, this is the scale, but I'll go back to this, and we'll get to that scale here in a second. But so again, the scale you use is up to you. I've seen a 3-scale risk with high, medium, and low. I've also seen a 5-scale risk where it's like high, medium, low, low. So it's just, it's up to personal preference. Do you want to do a 3 or a 5? You can even do a scale of up to 10 if you wanted to, and just come up with some creative names to name, you know, when you get into the middle numbers. You know, obviously like a 5 would be a medium, but I found that the 3 is usually an easy one to work through. And I try to think of the correlation between what damage can be done. Again, I gave the example of the weather, but you know, I look at it from the primarily, since I'm an IT guy, I look at it from the IT risk, of which you've probably heard me talk before about the CIA triad. No, it's not the spy organization, but it's basically an acronym for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. It's what us IT security people think of all the time. So I tend to think of things in those manners. But again, looking through some of these, if we just look at bottom one, 360 Office 365, having our credentials stolen. Credentials, another name for ID and password. And maybe our vulnerability is that we don't train our people well enough. Whereas doing the impact versus likeliness, if somebody gets my credentials to our Office 365, you know, that's a big impact. And the likelihood, because, you know, phishing routines out there are pretty, you know, you get 80% of cyber attacks result from a phishing scam. So obviously that's 3 times 3 is a 9. That's a high probability risk that we've got to address. So we might want to beef up our security awareness training to, you know, instead of doing a monthly phishing attack simulation, maybe we'll do it every other week. And then maybe if people fail the phishing exam multiple times, then we make them do additional IT security or cybersecurity awareness training. So there's a number of different things you can do. You know, probably one of the biggest things, there's a I think it was back in 2016, there was the big ransomware attack, the non-Petya or the Petya. I get them mixed up now. There was Petya, and then they came up with a clever name, not Petya. But they were basically both ransomware attacks. But those attacks actually happened because the exploit went out and took advantage of the vulnerability. I think it was in an older Windows environment, and the patches had actually been available for over 5 to 10 years, but a lot of people don't apply their patches, so their systems were still vulnerable, and they could be, you know, an exploit could be put in because of that vulnerability. So that's one of the big things you can do. Make sure you train your employees, make sure you patch your systems, and that you're going to be ahead of the game if you just take those 2 steps. But again, this was just building out our risk asset register. So then we're going to evaluate our risks. We're going to take considerations, and again, it's going to be to do that impact versus likeliness. And I talked about it before, and you're going to want to basically set up an XY axis. And again, this example uses 3 factors of risk. I've seen a lot of people use a five factor risk, and I color code it so that you got the high risk. If it comes up, you know, above 6, then you got the red. If it's low, it's green, and in the middle, it's yellow. Just makes it a lot easier for people to understand what you're doing. But basically, it's going to give you a picture of what is worth addressing. You know, what is the things you have to go after. So if you're doing that multiplication of likelihood times impact, you don't have to do anything that's less than a 3, because that's such a low risk. And that you want to definitely address the high areas. So let's move on. And then, so obviously you've identified your assets. You figured out what the threats and vulnerabilities are. You've done the risks calculation, and now you have to put controls in place. So on this last column here is where our controls come into play. And I've talked about that. The security awareness training is a good control to put in place. Patching of systems here is vulnerability management. And that's pretty easy to put into place. But again, you want to have a proper change management process in place to be able to go through and do that. But so if you just look through these, I think on the last, the Verizon, I'll talk about the Verizon a little bit later, but that data breach investigations report, which comes out, I think they publish it towards the end of May, and it's usually available either in May or in June. But I think it's typical that security awareness training, or lack of, is usually near the top of their list of things to do to improve the security of your organization. So as you can see, I have security awareness on quite a few of these assets as far as how to control them better. So now let's talk about the last thing. So we have all these risks. So the thing you have to do, like I talked before, you have your risk tolerance. So that's going to come into play with your options for what you're going to do. And these are primarily the 4 options that everybody has related to risk. And again, risk could be positive, risk could be negative. But so I'll take some time and walk through these steps. So you've got risk reduction. Basically, you're going to you want to eliminate or reduce that risk. And like I said, it's virtually impossible to totally eliminate risk, but you can at least reduce it to a point that's in your tolerance zone. So you want to basically reduce that to an acceptable level. And keep in mind that we've got the residual risk. So there's going to be some level of risk that's left over after we put the control in place. And keeping in mind that we're going to virtually have a very difficult, if not impossible, time getting to zero risk. The next outcome would be risk avoidance. And this is basically, I don't want to deal with this, so we're not gonna do X, Y, Z, or whatever it is. Now that's going to be possible in some situations and impossible in others. So if you go back to our earlier, let me flip back to this risk thing. So if we have Microsoft Office 365, which is our email, we've got a higher risk. We're not going to do risk avoidance and say, we're going to totally avoid having our credentials stolen because we're not going to use email. That's not an outcome that's going to be very doable for most organizations, because I think almost I've never run across an organization in recent time that didn't have email. So, but this is one of your 4 choices or 4 outcomes that you just totally avoid risk altogether. Next one is probably more common, which is the transfer of risk or sharing of the avoidance. And the best example I can give with that is either you're going to contract with a third party to accept some of that risk, and maybe you've outsourced your IT function to an MSP or managed service provider. And so they're gonna take a lot of your risk off and doing things, or maybe you get an insurance policy, and the insurance policy itself is a good reason why we have to do regular risk assessments, because if anybody's done insurance applications recently, I did the one for the firm back in the fall, and going through the questionnaire was actually, I think when we first started doing insurance applications. They were just a couple pages, and you could just go online and fill out a few questions on a web form, and all of a sudden you got insurance. And now I think the application that I did this past year was like 13 to 15 pages long. And one of the questions was, do you do an annual risk assessment? So it's not mandated through any regulation that we do our own risk assessment. We do one because it's good practice, and it helps us to receive those other benefits that I talked through earlier. But our insurance carrier wants us to be doing an annual risk assessment. So that's going to pop up more and more. And if you get cybersecurity insurance, you're probably going to run into a similar scenario there. So that's something to keep in mind. And then the last option that you get is basically just you're going to accept the risk. And that is basically you're assuming the risk and absorbing the losses if the risk is within tolerance or the cost mitigation exceeds the potential loss. Now, again, risk acceptance, one of the things that's going to come into play there, and I talk about this a lot too, if you've heard any of my other webinars or speaking engagements, is that you have, I always call it like the scales of justice almost, where you have your cost benefit, but you always have to keep that in mind when you're doing controls, is the risk that you're trying to control, what's the likeliness times the impact, what's that likely result going to be, and how much is it going to be? In other words, you don't want to spend, you've got a risk that you're going to try to mitigate. And if that risk happens, let's just pull a number out of there, it's going to cost you $5,000. So obviously you don't want to be spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to install a control. Maybe it's like the stuff on the movies where you have Mission Impossible, where they've got the biometric screening things where for Ethan Hunt to get into that chamber, he has to scan his retina and everything. So maybe you're not going to try that to save $5,000 of bad things from happening. You're not going to want to spend $100,000 on bio scanners and pressure sensitive floor that people can't walk on like we're in the set of a movie. But that is something to keep in mind always. This risk assessment will help you determine what the likely impact of a risk is, so then you can decide how much of a control can I afford or make sense to put in place. All right, so that's basically going through our risk assessment process, and we're going to, so now I've walked through, I've talked about terminology, I've given you some background, I've given you some reasons why you would want to do a risk assessment, whether it's regulation, whether it's because you need it for your insurance, et cetera, et cetera. So and I've actually given you a walkthrough of an asset-based risk assessment, so what do you do next? What actions should you take? And this is always, I think this is a valuable part of a webinar, is it actually gives you some action items to take. You could put this together as your game plan. So the first thing is come up with a risk assessment policy. If you can go out on the internet, there's sites, the one that I can think of right now is like the SANS Institute, and they'll have some retired IT related policies. So you could probably find one on risk assessment. I've done projects for clients where I've assisted them on putting together, IT security policies. So we can certainly help you in that aspect if so be it, or you can find samples out on the internet. But the first action step I would do is make sure that I have kind of like a rule or a game plan that I'm going to require my organization to do an annual risk assessment, because that's going to come into play when I talked earlier about the cybersecurity insurance. They're going to probably ask you if you do an annual risk assessment. They'll ask you if you have IT policies in place. They may even go to the level of asking what IT policies you have in place, or they might provide you with a list of policies and you have to check the box if you have one of those policies. So first step would be to get yourself a risk assessment policy, which doesn't have to be super elaborate. It can be just like a couple pages long. And like I said, if you need assistance, reach out to me. I can help you. Either we can do a project or I can point you in the right direction. Second action item would be to, if you're going to do the asset approach versus the scenario approach, your second action item would be to build out an asset register, which this presentation does in the step-by-step. I think you go back, there's like 4 steps where I keep adding. It's basically an Excel spreadsheet, and I just add to it and add to it and add to it. So that would be your next action item. Determine your threats and vulnerabilities, of which you can monitor certain things. There's a good publication. It's called is it Dark Reading, which is a subsidiary of Information Week. So they put out, I actually get a weekly newsletter from them, and they talk about like the big happenings in IT security for the previous week. And it'll say like, well, who got hacked and what happened. So that's a way that you can keep tabs on threats and vulnerabilities. The Verizon data breach investigation report that comes out annually, that does an excellent job at tracking threats and vulnerabilities, and it actually puts a different layer in there for you as far as like industry. And it says like, all right, based on XYZ industry is more vulnerable to this type of attack versus this industry is vulnerable to that type of attack. So a lot of things you can do there to keep tabs on threats and vulnerabilities. And then you want to actually conduct your risk assessment. And that's more or less the scale that we talked about, where you've got either the 3 factors on the XY axis or 5 or however many you want, and measure yourself as far as like, all right, here's my asset, here's the threat and the vulnerability, and this is the impact if something bad would happen. This is the likeliness of something bad happening, and you do the math, then you rank everything and you see what your most risky things are, and then you're going to want to put controls in place to try to mitigate those risks as much as possible. And then apply those 4 options for the risk treatment, whether it's risk avoidance, risk acceptance, easy for me to say, right? Or sharing, etc. So there's 4 options that could be for each one of those risk plans, but this is a good way to get you started. So that's this will be a good plan of action for you. So keep in mind of this slide if you when you download the presentation to use. And then this is our last CPE question. So it's not a very difficult one, but if you want CPE, definitely answer yes to this question. And if you answered the previous 3, then we will probably within, usually it takes us 2 or 3 days to process these, but we'll actually send you a certificate by email. So I'll just shut up here for a few seconds and let people answer this question. Okay, Michelle, when we're ready, just let me know and flip the slide. Okay, so now I'll move on to our last agenda item, and it's basically to wrap things up. So as I wrap things up today, so I believe there's been a lot of valuable information presented. And again, if you haven't already downloaded the copy of the slide deck, be sure to do that from the Meeting Control Center. And so I'd suggest that if you're planning on doing your own risk assessment, or if you've got the mandate to do one because of maybe an IT security, insurance policy, etc., it's a good good guide to get you through to do at least a basic risk assessment. And we covered, again, background, why you would need to do a risk assessment, and then actually walk through a little case study of doing a risk assessment. And then we're still going to have our Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, or if something I said didn't make sense, then just by all means, please submit questions into the Q&A box, and we'll do the best to answer them. And if we think we're pretty good on time here, but if you come up with a question after the fact, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll get you. Let me flip the slide here. So I put my contact information up. You can call me. That's our number here at the Canfield office, or you can email me, and I will, if I haven't had a chance to answer your question online here, or if you think of something after the fact, feel free to reach out to me. I hope that you found this webinar of some value, and that it was worthwhile for you attending this morning. And as always, I'm here to answer questions. I'll be doing that for the next few minutes online here, or you can reach out to me afterwards. So with that being said, Michelle, you're watching the Q&A box. Do we have any questions that have come in since I've been talking here today?
Yes, the first question that came in was, have you seen a greater need for risk assessments recently?
Actually, like I said, I don't want to really repeat myself, but it's more prevalent now with the, and I think it's just because it's harder to get cybersecurity insurance now than it used to be. Like I said before, when it used to just be a short web form, or now it's up to, like, my application here that I did last fall was up over 13 pages, and that was pretty much single space. So there was a lot of questions that they wanted. So that is more and more becoming a requirement. So you can't get a lot of insurance, cyber or other types, without having some IT controls in place, of which one they view is the risk assessment. Because if you think about it, the risk assessment makes a whole heck of a lot of sense, as far as it forces you to look at your assets and figure out what you have, so you know what you have to protect. So it really is quite a valuable exercise, because you do those, what you've got, what you have to protect, and then you can actually be a little bit objective as far as what's the most important things to protect, I should say. So I know that was a long-winded answer, but definitely we've seen a bigger need for risk assessments lately. Any other questions out there?
Yes. Does HBK offer any services to help companies protect themselves against cyber threats?
Absolutely. So we have a couple of things that we do, and I've talked about these a lot. And I indicated that we'll see what happens in later this year in May or June, once the weather gets a little bit warmer here, and the Verizon report is issued. So they'll come out and say what the most, by industry, what the most likely attacks are that are being experienced in those industries. But usually it comes out that it suggests that you put a control in place of security awareness training. And I think that usually will hold true, because stats from last year that I saw, I think almost 90% of all cyber attacks are initiated through a phishing attack. So that security awareness, we do those. We can do an actual session for you. We can do phishing training simulations. I talked about the some of the breaches with the one back, the Petya, non-Petya back in 16. Those were because systems weren't patched. So we actually offer vulnerability scanning where we can do external or internal scans and vary the intervals, whether it's quarterly or monthly. And those are a big help. And then, like I said, we've helped companies write IT security policies. We can assess your cybersecurity program, the maturity of it. We can even do cybersecurity insurance assessments where we can basically we sit down and if we've got a cybersecurity insurance expert that we work with and we actually partner with him on those engagements and sit down and understand your business and figure out, what type of coverage you have based on how you're conducting business, and we can give you some insights as to how if you've got enough coverage in certain areas. So all those areas, we can definitely help you out. If you have a concern and it wasn't addressed by what I just went through on that list, then reach out to me and we can talk directly. Any other questions there, Michelle?
That was all for right now.
Okay. All right, great. So again, I'd like to thank everybody for attending this morning. Hopefully you found it worthwhile. And I wanted to give you a little hold the date, save the date, whatever they refer to that as. Our next webinar is going to be in April on the 26th, I believe. Let me check my calendar here. Yes, April 26th. And we're actually going to have a guest along with me for that. We're going to talk about, it's a gentleman from a firm that started up in Cleveland that does forensics, computer forensics. So they're the guys that you call if you've had a breach or something, and they'll figure out what happened. So we're going to talk with a member from that company, and then we're going to talk about what to do if you experience a cyber attack. It's like, obviously you're going to call somebody, but like, what are the first steps you can do to put yourself in a better situation? So that's coming up on April 26th, and we'll be sending out invites probably 1 to 2 weeks ahead. So look for right around tax deadline time that we should be getting an invite out for you to attend that webinar. But that should be a really good one as well. So again, thanks. Hope you enjoyed it and enjoy the rest of your day. And thanks for joining. Have a great one.